Well, first of all, it's a long introduction. I wasn't expecting so long. I want to really thank you for allowing me to come here. I came here from Jerusalem. I came here specifically for this conference, and I'll be going back to Jerusalem after that. And mostly, I want to give my special appreciation to Sheikh Abrahamson, who I've known for several years and have had the honor and the privilege to benefit from his learning and from his wisdom. When I first heard about the Onyx Foundation, which was formed a couple of years ago, I saw the word onyx, and I didn't know quite why they chose the term, but there's a tradition in Judaism that when Moses was a little child in Pharaoh's court, that he knocked the crown off of Pharaoh's head. And Pharaoh was all upset. What's going to happen? This little child Moses is going to take over his kingdom. So he wanted to test him. He put him a bunch of jewels in front of him, and he put some coals to see if this little child was very wise. And so what did Moses do? He stuck his hands out towards the jewels. But it says an angel came and pushed his hand towards the coals so that Pharaoh wouldn't suspect him of being wanting to take over his kingdom. This tradition is also brought in Islamic literature as well. But the jewel that Moses was attracted to was the onyx stone. And it was the stone that contains all colors. And this indeed, the prophet Moses, was indeed reaching out to all people of all colors and all kinds. So also another thing is, this completes a circle for me of 120 years. My grandparents were born in the East End of London. My great-grandparents, my great-grandfather worked in some boating. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing, but he was, in 1906, he was transporting some refugees from some kind of persecution. Something was going on in this area, and it turned out that that's where my grandmother was born. So one of my most fond memories of my grandmother was how proud she was that she was born in Wales. Oh. So. So I have several slides here. Hope I'll be able to bring over this information. The Al-Tzadikim Institute is an association of Muslim and rabbinic scholars worldwide. Mostly it's a scholarly organization. It's not a theological. We do historical work about legal and judicial and historical connections between Islam and Judaism. These are some of the books we do. What we're I could be talking about Islam and Jewish connections between citizenship. I could be talking about what is going on in the Ottoman Empire and the way they handled systems, what happens in Israel, what's happened in ancient Israel. But I wanted to focus specifically on the Jewish perspective. Not necessarily tie in all the connections with Islamic history, and also with UK history. So first I'll go over to what happened in the ancient Hebrew Republic, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what's happened in the United Kingdom. All the terms we've talked about, or everything that's important to us, the idea of being a nation, important to this conference, is being a nation, a citizen, coexistence, equality, faith, and morality. All these things are talked about in the Bible. We can see, for an example, we're talking about the children of Noah, who was said to have 70 sons, and each of these sons made a nation. And at the very end of that verse in Genesis 10:31, it talks about these nations are defined by their families, their language, and their land. And we see that even today in legal history, in law, we have people, their nationalities are defined by these exact three terms: their families, jus sanguinis or jus solis, by their land where a person is born, or by naturalization, by the language and culture. So we see today that the institutions that exist around us today have their foundations in Scripture, or at least have a connection with it. A nation in the biblical concept, first, in order to get to the concept of citizen, I'd like to define what is a nation. So a nation is less than a global concept. In fact, in the Torah, the concept of being totally global and homogeneous is not a good thing. We read about the Tower of Babel, where it says the entire world and the entire earth was the entire earth was of one language and uniform words. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, Babel, a tower on its top, and make war with God." And the idea is, if you lose distinctions, if everybody is the same, you begin to think you know everything. There's nothing else to learn. It's only when you see differences and there's something beyond yourself that you're challenged to realize that people may not know everything. And if everything becomes homogeneous, then we fall into pride. Almost as a defense against this, the accounts in Scripture and Torah talk about the nation as the highest in a hierarchy of associations, of contractual obligations, the lowest being, or the foundation being the man and wife, and then you have the family, and then you had the tribe and the community, and they also had economic guilds, and the nation was pulling it all together. Each of these groups formed the federations of smaller units towards a common goal. The hallmark, what defines a nation? Well, a nation is a group of people who came together for a common goal. And in the Torah concept, a common goal is defined by commandments. And if you look where the first time the word commandment is used in the Bible, it's in Genesis when Adam is told not to eat from he's commanded not to eat from the tree of the Garden of Eden. And from these words that are used in that verse, they understand these 7 principles, which are basically 7 of the 10 commandments. That you should believe in one and only God, the single ultimate cause of all things and source of all reason. You should respect and submit to God, and this is expressed by the prohibition of cursing God. The protection of life, the protecting the concept of family, protection of the property. The freedom to enjoy has to be limited by moral and social consequences, and this is described in the Torah as not eating from a living animal, not taking what's not permitted. And the foundation of this is ensuring justice. We have an obligation to found the courts to provide justice. So this is the hallmark of a nation. This is the minimum requirement that the Torah talks about a nation. This basic law from God, which in Hebrew is called din, also in Arabic it's called din, it's the discrimination between the law of nations and the law of and lawless nations. It's between barbarism and civilization. It's not what people think between one group of religious believers and another group of religious believers. It's the basic difference between people who are keeping the minimum requirement of civilization and those who disregard and believe that murder is permitted, that there's no reason, that property has no meaning. It's between the civilization and the lack thereof. And to reject these principles is to become a rogue nation or an outlaw. And we believe that there is no din, no basic law other than these principles which is acceptable before God. And this is all brought by the Miri. In fact, I have sources for everything here. I'm not going to go over it or it would take too long. So in this context, these 7 laws are the minimum requirement that a person needs to be an acceptable citizen, an acceptable person before God. It may be that he hasn't done any good things in his life, or his portion is very small, but he's still acceptable. This is the minimum definition of a person who's guaranteed a portion in the hereafter, or what you call sometimes salvation. That a person who keeps these 7 laws, whatever religion or practice or customs or nation he belongs to, has a portion in the world to come. And this is the minimum definition of a believer and the minimum definition of a citizen in a civilized nation. So above the nation itself, you have what we call covenants, brit, or in Islam we call sharia. You have a way of life. At the account of when the Torah was given, when we read about Moses going up and collecting the tablets, God spoke to the children of Israel in 70 languages. Moses wrote all this down and passed this on, but it says in Deuteronomy that the Lord came from Sinai. He shone from Mount Seir, which is in Jordan, and he appeared from Mount Paran, which is in Arabia. And the words that are used here, ba, Zorach, Hofia. These are similar to words in Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic. And other. We have the tradition that the God spoke in 70 languages simultaneously to all the nations of the world when the Torah was given. So everybody has a portion of this. They say, why was the Torah given in the middle of the desert? It was to show that it doesn't belong to anyone. There's no one person who can claim this belongs to him. It belongs to all of mankind. We got here, going backwards. Rabbi Ben Moseg, who is his school of thought is basically the school of thought behind the Al Tzadikim Foundation, mentioned that one of the striking concepts of this narrative or this explanation of the giving of Torah and the generations of Noah is that no one nation, even there were differences, and there were supposed to be differences, we weren't all supposed to be the same thing, no one group was said to be better than another, and no one group was supposed to be exclusive and say, I'm the best one, you're not part of this. As it's taught in Jewish tradition, that the non-Jew who studies Torah or studies the commandments that belong to him can reach the highest level, the high priest of Judaism. So we can all attain the greatest level. And these are all 70 covenants going on at the same time. For example, it's explained in the Talmud that the covenant or the national contract, the obligation for the nation of Israel was centered around the symbolic institution of the temple and the preservation and transmission of the Torah for all the benefit of all mankind. And they also gives a little discourse that talks about in Rome. What did they do? They were, at least as envisioned by the rabbis who were writing this, they envisioned to establish markets, to improve hygiene, to establish an economic system for the benefit of mankind. This was something that was a divine task for them. And Persia, according to the rabbinic conception of this, they were to facilitate cultural commerce, to quell rebellions, to establish an effective administration for the benefit of all mankind. Every nation had an identity, had a way it was going, had a direction, something that was pulling them all together, something that brought everyone who was part of the nation felt they were there for a reason. And there's a certain limit to what one nation can understand from another nation. It's explained that the Torah gives us no criteria for judging a non-Jewish prophet. We know you read in Deuteronomy that a person has to teach what Moses taught, that he's not allowed to teach other things. This is for a prophet for the children of Israel. But the Torah also teaches there were thousands and thousands of prophets sent to other nations. And we have to respect that, and we don't know necessarily what happened. Rabbi Ben Moseg even says this is the context from the New Testament where it's quoted in Romans that he said the Greek thinkers and philosophers from God that God has in every age sent among them will recall them to the sacred truth and will one day be their reproof. In other words, even the philosophers, or even people who we wouldn't have considered to be Israelite prophets, were among the non-Jewish nations calling them to God. So this is the idea of nations. You don't have a homogeneous, one world, homogeneous society where all you have is the citizen and the world and nothing in between. You have groups. You have, at the smallest, you have the husband and wife, you have the family, the tribe, the community, up to the nation. And within the nation, you have citizens. Now, the Torah describes six different kinds of citizens. You have the children of Israel, where people were born into this, and then you have the naturalized alien, or what we call the Ger Tzedek. You have the foreign resident, somebody who belonged to another country but came to live in Israel. You have those under the king's jurisdiction, and you had foreigners, Nochri, and then you had rogue and outlaws called Akum. Now, the first two names here are usually what you call, today, use the term Jew, or Israel, or these are the people, the children of Israel. And the other four terms are non-Jews or Gentiles. And unfortunately, people have mistaken, they throw them all together, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but they've misused these terms and not really understood them. Again, what I'm trying to describe here is how did nationality and citizenship work in the ancient Hebrew Republic? To become a native-born citizen of the Hebrew Republic, it was based on your family. A person who was born of a Jewish mother was part of the Jewish nation. They had an obligation to keep the Jewish covenant. A person who could become part of a naturalized citizen by renouncing his allegiance to another nation and declaring that he'll uphold the common and particular laws of the children of Israel. He'll uphold the territorial possessions of that nation. He'll uphold the other citizens of that nation. And he'll uphold the national covenant of the nation, as symbolized by circumcision, baptism, sacrifice. This is all based on a passage in Ruth, when Ruth said what she said, that she would become part of the Jewish nation. And then there was the concept of the foreign resident. The foreign residents, I'll explain the second part of this. What I have to say is this is the most important section, but these were people who came from other nations who wanted to live in the nation of Israel, but they weren't part of the children of Israel, and they didn't particularly want to be part of their culture. They had to accept the sovereignty of the court. They had to be part of the judicial system. I think it was mentioned previously that you can't have peace unless you have a single judicial system. If I'll digress, the Constitution of Medina, one of the reasons why it worked is because you had the Jewish people and the Muslim people together under a unified, it wasn't, the Jewish people had their legal system and the Muslims had their legal system, but together it was unified together as a single unit system. They would go to the Prophet, peace be upon him, to show the unity of the judicial system. So you need, become a foreign resident in the nation of Israel. You had to uphold, accept the sovereignty of the judicial system, and you had to uphold the universal civil law. What's that? Does that mean you have to keep Sabbath? You have to keep kosher? No. All you had to do was keep those 7 laws that we talked about. What we said was the minimum requirement to be a civilized person. And you had to uphold other nations of the citizen, and you had to say what legals, if you're not going to keep the Jewish national contract, the Jewish covenant, what covenant were you going to keep? What group of people do you belong to? There were anti-discrimination laws, that if a person became a naturalized citizen, he belonged to another country and he became part of the Jewish people, you're not allowed to wrong them with speech, with harassment. This is in Isaiah. You're not allowed to oppress him with money dealings. You're not allowed to oppress him due to race, his culture, or his natural origin, as it says in Exodus. And the dignity of naturalized aliens that became citizens and foreign residents has to be preserved. They have to have dignity, not just that they have to be tolerated, but they have to live in a dignified way. So society, this is the concept of the citizens in the Hebrew Republic. And then you had the idea of what laws did they follow. Well, the first 2, we talked about the children of Israel and the people who become naturalized. They would follow the entire Torah. The Torah means guidance. And they would also follow mishpat, which means the minimum civil law, or secular law, what they talk about today. So they had to follow the Torah law, and they also had to follow the civil law. The foreign resident would only have to follow the civil law, and he would follow whatever foreign law. If he was Greek, he was Roman, he would follow that law as well. There were also theirs under the people under the king's jurisdiction. They only had to follow the civil law. Foreigners who came, they lived under the foreign law, and rogues of outlaw, they didn't follow any of the above. So we talk about what was the national goal. What was the goal of the nation of the Hebrew Republic, of the nation of Israel? What was their goal? Their goal was centered around, like I said, the symbolic institution of the temple and the preservation and transmission of the Torah. But the foreign residents who weren't part of this, what did they do? It says because they had declared that they want to belong to a foreign culture, they had complete freedom to practice that culture, to live, to do everything that belonged. If they were Greek, they could follow Greek traditions. And we're talking about the Hebrew Republic. They could, if they were Nabatean, they could do Nabatean things, as long as it didn't conflict with the scope of civil law. In other words, we're not talking about all the 613 commandments that Jews followed, just the 7 laws of basic humanity. And not only that, is that if they chose not to participate in the wide range of culture of the children of Israel, they had to be protected in such a way that they would not, so that the Jewish people, the children of Israel, would not detract from the Torah's commandment that they would in any way be disrespected, that they would not be given respect and honor, that they would be given charity, that they would be allowed to make a living, and this foreign resident is to be treated as a citizen. Okay? In addition, if they want to participate with the national culture, they can, and the way this is, they can even be given authority to participate and contribute to the culture. For instance, the Samaritans are an example of a community that lived within a community. The Samaritans lived within the larger Jewish, the Hebrew Republic, and they had their own court systems. They had their own law, and this was all sanctioned by the government of Israel, by the government of at that time, and when it was determined that their laws, for instance, of milk and of meat, of kosher, of these things were the same as Jews, they were certified as completely satisfying and contributing to the greater culture as well. So not only they could play a dual role, we were talking about with the Venn diagrams, there was this the interaction where not only were they contributing to their own identity, but they were contributing to the identity of the greater nation. And then just briefly for other nations, it's explained that when the children of Noah, these other 70 nations that we say in the world, also did the same model, and they created their own systems, and even what we see today is derived from these original commandments that were given to Adam. So even the laws of nations which have nothing to do with the children of Israel, stopping at a red light, for instance, has at its very root going all the way back to a commandment, back to God. So it has a certain specialness about it. Okay. So again, we talk about the citizens have a responsibility. We talked before about the national contract or the national covenant. There was a certain goal that the whole nation was going for, and then there's also a social contract that every citizen as an individual has to be involved with as well. It says your brother becomes destitute, you have to help him. These are the rights of the foreign residents. You shouldn't do wrong, you shouldn't oppress him. And explain they have certain rights as well. They also have their own courts, as I mentioned with the Samaritans. They had their own courts, they had the right to be judged under their peers. Yes. Yeah, gotta go nuts. And then one mention about the legal system itself. There's the idea of there are many. When you read about the Torah, you read about many different laws. Some of them seem very striking. We will have stoning and things like that. There is a concept between a Western and Eastern tradition of law. In the Oriental, or at least specifically in the Torah concept, you have a heavenly court and an earthly court. With the heavenly court, all these commandments that say you can't do this, you can't do this, all these are judged by God, who sees all and knows all and does this. But in terms of the physical earthly court, their job was to do the minimum it was required to assure social civil peace, that the society should function properly. So they were supposed to take a subset of all these laws that are mentioned in the Torah and put this into action. Okay? So I'll go this, Roman this. There was a balance of powers in the government between the king and the prophet. The king represented the wants and needs of the people. The prophet represented the moral rights and obligations towards God. The king was anointed or put into power by the prophet, and the prophet could take that power back, but only the king could enforce any of the laws. The king could raise an army and collect taxes. The prophet could do another. So you had a balance that way. I'll just skip to the next here. Coming to England. Coming to Europe. Eric Nelson, a professor at Harvard University, he makes a wonderful presentation on this. He says that we've often been taught that in the last 200 years, we went from being a very theological people, all very religious people, to getting like Isaac Newton and getting a very metaphysical, wondering how the world is put together. And then finally, in the last 100 years, we've become very rational and very settled. And the truth is that nothing could be farther from the truth. The idea of religious tolerance is not something that was invented by secular humanists. The idea of religious tolerance was, and all human rights in general, during the times of the English Civil War, you had tremendous religious fervor. You had the Quakers, the ranters, the seekers. You had people trying to blow up Parliament. You had a tremendous religious fervor. And the people who decided that you should give religious freedom were not secularists, but they were deeply religious people giving religious freedom for deeply religious reasons. Human rights and freedom of religion was obtained by deep religious people for religious reasons. Many, if not most, of our fundamental commitments emerged of a deeply theological concept, explicitly justified on the first instance on the basis of religious claims. They talk about Erastus, and a lot of people think that Erastus talks about church and state, that you should keep them far away. Well, that's really not true. If you'd really study Erastus, what Erastus is talking about is that the state itself, the civil magistracy, should handle all forms of coercion. Even religious obligations would be done in a minimal amount of way, exactly as I was talking about, based on the Torah concepts. John Selden was one of the principal architects of the English government right after or actually before, during, and after the English Civil War. And his whole vision of the English government was that experiments, he agreed with Calvin's assumption that the civil government, what we talk about, what we see today, is to cherish and support the external worship of God, to preserve the doctrine of religion, to defend the constitution of the church, to regulate our lives in a manner requisite for the society of men, to form our manners to civil justice, and that spiritual labor might best be exerted and encouraged and in no way stifled. In other words, what you had in the 1600s were people that were trying to say, as for religious reasons, we have to go back to the Torah concept of the resident alien and say that we have people living here, as long as they keep these 7 minimal commandments, that's fine. And that God will decide the rest. And that these 7 commandments assure civil society. But not only that they did that with the specific reason that religion should be encouraged, that every religious group should be allowed to grow, to expand, and explore their religious environment, and in no way stifled. John Selden is just wonderful about what he did. He was called the glory of the English nation by Gratus. He was called the chief learned men, a repute in this land by John Milton. He went on and on about how you could take from the Torah, take from the Bible, and create a commonwealth that would provide freedom for all the very religious people that were going on. And I could digress a little bit and talk about how he borrowed, or at least was in some ways maybe inspired by what was going on in the Ottoman Empire at the same time. But the Judeo-Christian heritage, which you hear so much about in Europe and in England, didn't involve any Jews. There weren't any Jews involved in the Judeo-Christian heritage. What you had were Christians who were reading the Torah, they were reading Maimonides, Josephus, and other rabbinic works, to structure a society to encourage religious expression without stifling it. And what you had here in England, you had John Selden putting together a society. You had 2 sets of parliament set up, a House of Lords, House of Commons. Why was that? We had the balance of power between king and prophet. You had one body that was supposed to reflect the needs and wants and desires of the people, and you had another body that was supposed to provide moral limitations, to direction for that when a law would pass between these 2 houses, it could be well-founded. And then you had, at the same time, you had France, where they didn't take this path. They didn't say you should look to our religious heritage, give religious freedom for religious reasons. They said, let's separate church and state completely, and off with their heads. You had a reign of terror. It's really a tale of 2 cities. What happened in England and what happened in France were completely different. France had, Paris had a complete separation, church and state, a complete defunding of the church, and it ended in a reign of terror. And what happened in England, you were able to put society back together again. You were able to give freedom to Calvinists, to Protestants, to Presbyterians. And it took a while. Things didn't go smoothly all the time, but at least it formed a structure which dealt with many of the same issues that we have today. Yep. Basically, so John Selden delved into the models of what I was talking about, the Hebrew Republic, and he specifically used that model, and he chose the concept of the resident alien, the person who had the freedom to keep the minimum 7 laws, the minimum balance of civility, that would become all citizens would like that. As he said in his table talk, the idea of religion is that it initiates things that we talked about, the Venn diagram with the two interacting things. Well, their model then was actually one inside of the other. The state was to draw from the morality of what scriptural values can give, and the government was supposed to enforce the minimum amount to keep civil peace, but to encourage religious expression, encourage religious exploration. People can explore. As it says, the parish makes the constable, and when the constable's made, he governs the parish. So there was definitely kind of things. But what's happened since Selden Day is we don't have so much Quakers and Ranters and Seekers and all these people now. We have another kind of religion which is coming up, and at least from the Jewish point of view, humanism and atheism are moral systems which guide people's lives. They make decisions whether they should do something or should not do something, but they're essentially religions as well. And there was the sense that like I say here, according to the founders of Western governments, Adam was given 7 of the 10 commandments, and Adam was humanity. These basics laws were the foundations of all civilized human behavior, and they were given by God. And even if a person didn't believe in God, he had to behave as if they were, because these basic fundamental requirements of civil society had to be beyond the noise of consensus, of personal preference, and regular humanism. Hasn't declared itself to be a religion, but it functions as one. And what happens is it takes over a certain primacy. When you have a debate, a moral debate, what's permitted and what's permitted, for some reason global norms seem to have a higher weight than any other religious tradition, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Because law can't be divorced from morals. I have a list of examples of Good Samaritan laws, where you're going to punish a person for trying to save a person the best way he knows how. Police questioning young children and their views. There's no way to divorce law from morals. There's also a problem with the Supreme Court in the Western concept. It's the highest court of appeals, but it's also the arbitrator of some of the most controversial issues. So you have one place doing both of those. But the conclusion of all this, and since I deal with both Muslims and Jews, I'm addressing here, is that Western secular law is actually based on, in particular the English system, is based on the 7 laws, or what we call the Deen of Noah. And this, in a certain way, has a connection with the Deen of Islam, the basic minimum requirement of morality. And this means that a law-abiding citizen, anybody who's a law-abiding citizen, no matter from what background he is, should not fear or feel threatened by any other law-abiding citizen from any other background. And it's a pragmatic approximation of what the Torah called a believer who kept these minimum requirements. Now, why this doesn't fulfill, it doesn't make a person a perfect believer or a perfect religious follower, but it's a pragmatic approximation, just like our judicial system is an approximation of justice. We can never be there at all times to see every bit of evidence. So our justice system tries to approximate justice and do the best we can. The same thing as a citizen is an approximation for a believer. And when there's aberrations in the system, when any religious system or any group tries to claim supremacy, whether it's Christianity, whether it's atheism or humanism, exceeds the mandate of the magistrate, that we've talked about the foundation of the European and especially the English government system, when they exceed the mandate to enforce, and it encroaches on the rights of religious communities, this should be open to public debate, and one can expect and demand fair dialogue. The conclusion for Europeans, Islamic deen, what Muslims talk all the time, with, there's no religion acceptable before God except for Islam. Well, the word religion there is deen, which doesn't mean you have to make a pilgrimage to Mecca and you have to keep Ramadan, all this. The word deen there is basic, submission to God. When I talk about this approximation of being a believer, the deen, you have to have the submission to God and morality. It's connected like the Judeo-Christian concept of Noahidism or the laws of Noah. And it's the basic measure of civil behavior. So when we say the whole world, we want to be Muslim, if you dig down there, what it's actually saying is we want the whole world to be a civilized, moral society. It's neither all that foreign or different from the Western tradition of basic law, and it's the obligation of every civilized human being to work that all mankind should measure up to this minimum standard. It's only when this deen becomes blurred with Sharia, which is the basic law together with the detailed law, that you start to have violent confrontations, or when law-abiding citizens are not respected or denied dignity. This oversteps what the state allows, and it also oversteps what Islam allows. And the conclusion for Jews is that the Judeo-Christian heritage, as envisioned by John Selden, not only chose to restrict the role of the government to enforce only the minimum amount of laws that would ensure civil order, but would leave room for deep religious communities such as the Quakers, Seekers, and Renters, and one of the first communities to benefit from that were the Jews, who Cromwell invited back into England. The Jews obtained freedom to create and develop their society here in this land, and the Jews were able to form their own community, courts, even do binding arbitration at times. There was common ground, and even to the point where the Jews were able to participate in English culture, tradition, and heritage. And now is the time, and this is the message for Jews, to work for the same rights for all their co-religious, all their fellow citizens, from which they share so much, to eliminate misunderstandings and to foster clarity. So, and my hope is that I pray that I've, you can see what I say here, foster clarity in this presentation, and that's it. My presentation.